History of the Hungarian People's Republic. Contemporary anti-communists and Hungarian right-wing nationalists claim that the Soviet Union deported large amounts of so-called innocent Hungarians to work in the Soviet Union in the aftermath of World War II. Despite being widespread, this claim is basically a distortion. First of all, anti-communist historians admit that the exact number of these deported people is unknown. Some anti-communists might be trying to include those who died in battle or went missing in action as supposedly deported or dead in prisoner of war camps. We shouldn't accept any numbers they throw at us because they have a strong anti-communist bias and because both the numbers of Hungarian war casualties and the number of prisoners are uncertain. Secondly, and more importantly, the vast majority of these so-called deported people were Hungarian prisoners of war, fascist soldiers, not deportees at all. Many of these soldiers had committed horrible atrocities and crimes when they were invading the USSR. The German Nazi leader Goebbels writes in his diary on May 19, 1942, that Hungarian fascist forces were sent to, quote-unquote, pacify partisan resistance in Soviet villages. While doing this, the Hungarian fascists carried out terrible atrocities. Goebbels writes, quote, Hungarian elements are fighting under great difficulties. They must now capture one village after another and pacify it, a thing that has not proved any too constructive. For when the Hungarians report that they have pacified a village, this usually means that not a single inhabitant is left. That means in turn that we can hardly get any agricultural work done in such regions. Unquote. In Yugoslavia, quote, under the pretext of reprisals, the Hungarian army and gendarmerie carried out organized massacres of the Serbian and Jewish population. The army instituted a regime of terror and isolated the area. The indiscriminate murders were accompanied by extensive looting. Unquote. It is not unreasonable that the soldiers who invaded the Soviet Union without any provocation or justification needed to work to repair at least some of the damage that they had caused. Of course, they could never resurrect all the innocent civilians they murdered. It is also highly questionable to label the fascist invaders as victims and the Soviets who forced the fascists to repair some of the damage they caused as some kind of oppressors. As admitted by a contemporary anti-communist historian, quote, the Soviet Union's need for prisoner of war work, given the truly enormous damage to the country, was de facto recognized by the Western powers. Unquote. And not only de facto, but the Western Allies themselves promoted deportation of large amounts of people at the Potsdam Conference in 1946. Quote, the Potsdam decision provided the legal basis for the compulsory transfer of German populations from Czechoslovakia, from the Polish incorporated eastern provinces of Germany, and from Hungary. Unquote. The Western Allies supported deportation even in the cases where it didn't involve settler colonialists, prisoners of war, or war criminals. The Soviet view was more nuanced, and the communists supported deportation only of actual criminals and fascists. This will become clearer further on. Furthermore, who actually were deported from Hungary included mostly Nazis, fascists, war criminals, and others like them, as well as some settlers who had occupied foreign territories. A significant chunk were also not Hungarian at all, but German settlers and Swabians inside Hungary and inside Transylvania, which was a territory contested by Hungary and Romania. Anti-communist historians simply choose to categorize these people as Hungarians. The so-called Volksdeutsch or German minorities were used by the Nazis mostly as settlers in Poland. As capitalist historian Schechtman writes, quote, German minorities, Volksdeutsch, quote-unquote, came home to the Reich, 900,000 persons scattered throughout northeast and southeast Europe, unquote. He writes further that the Volksdeutsch became a problem for post-war countries because they were, quote-unquote, manifestly disloyal to their respective countries and had instead been working with the German Nazis. He writes, quote, when in the latter part of 1944 the doom of the Axis and the end of the war were becoming visible, the pattern of wholesale population transfer as previously established and widely implemented by the Third Reich now became a matter of immediate practical concern for a number of European states that comprised sizable and manifestly disloyal German ethnic minorities. Unquote. As a result, 6 million Germans were expelled from the parts of Poland conquered and settled by Germany, This is where most of the settlers were. Czechoslovakia was also rather aggressive in deporting Germans, deporting 2.5 million. More than 100,000 were deported from Hungary. However, according to Pittaway, practically all from Transylvania, which fascist Hungary had only recently conquered. He writes, quote, "According to some estimates, almost 100,000 males were deported from Transylvania," unquote. This is because nearly 100,000 Transylvanian Germans had joined the SS, or were fascist war criminals of different types. This also explains why the deportees were almost all males, that is, soldiers. According to historians Paul Milada, Jan-Erik Schulte, and Mikhail Wild, approximately 63,000, or 95%, of the male Germans in Transylvania who were military age voluntarily enrolled into the Waffen-SS units. Paul Milada also writes in one of his papers that, quote, "About 63,560 men of the total strength of the Waffen-SS were Germans from Romania," unquote. To be exact, from Transylvania. It's a little bit confusing because Transylvania used to belong to Romania, but Hungary briefly conquered it during World War II. The relatively large level of Nazi collaboration among the Germans in Hungary, excluding Transylvania, is suggested by the fact that, quote, 100,000 Germans had left Hungary in 1944 to 45 with the retreating German armies, unquote. Membership of the Nazi Volksbund organization for Germans in Hungary was, quote, 97,000 in the spring of 1941, unquote, according to historian Henry A. Fischer. The deported Hungarian Germans consisted of the approximately 100,000 Volksbund members and the approximately 100,000 Transylvanian Waffen-SS volunteers. These were hardly so-called innocent people, and it's also rather misleading to label them as innocent Hungarians, because they were actually a German national minority. As said earlier, the Western powers themselves actually endorsed massive population transfers, mainly targeting the Germans. As Schechtman writes, quote, "The Western Allies, in principle, endorsed schemes for the organized transfer of their German populations and at various times issued clear and binding statements to this effect," unquote. Now, it is true that the conditions in Soviet prisoner of war camps were very bad and food was scarce. However, we must remember that conditions were very bad all over the country, and there was a bad food shortage and starvation in 1946, which affected everybody. This was because of the devastating damage the fascist invaders had caused to the Soviet Union. The most important thing which anti-communists always ignore is that most of the Hungarian prisoners of war in the USSR were actually released very soon. The decision to free many of the prisoners was reached already in 1945 and began in 1946. The treatment of regular prisoners of war was actually very lenient in this regard. The government of post-war Hungary, and in particular the communist leader Mátyás Rákosi, negotiated with the Soviets to release the regular prisoners quickly. Regular soldiers and officials were thus freed, though war criminals and SS members were not. The Soviets were open about the fact that prisoner labor from fascist war criminals and invaders would be used to repair some of the damage that they had done. According to American journalist Edgar, quote, "No one could foresee how much German labor would be left to mobilize for the task of Soviet reconstruction, but Moscow made clear its intention of utilizing it. The well-known Soviet economist Eugene Varga, who frequently speaks for the Kremlin, estimated that it would take a decade for 10 million Germans, working 24 hours a day, to repair the damage that Hitler has done to Russia. Varga recommended the widespread employment of German labor in payment of reparations, which he thinks may run into the neighborhood of $260 billion. In addition to the use of war criminal and ex-Nazi, and possibly some Romanian, Hungarian and Finnish labor, the Russians may transport certain German industries to Soviet soil, although they have disavowed any intention of quote-unquote annihilating German industry, unquote. Indeed, annihilating German industry and de-industrializing Germany was what some people in the West wanted to do. Edgar further explains, quote, "More than 800,000 square miles of Russia were occupied by the Germans and their allies. It was only a tenth of the USSR, but it held a third of Russia's population, and its devastation meant the loss of half of the Soviet coal mines, half the electric power, 3/5 of the iron mines, and about half the steel and machinery industry." What the Russians liberated was for the most part a desert of worthless rubble, with its great cities from 30% to 90% destroyed. Last year, the Russian authorities told me that 4 million people in Ukraine alone would have to live in caves or lean-tos made of wreckage for another 2 years. Altogether, 6 million dwellings and buildings, which provided what was very poor housing to 25 million people, were consumed by fascism, as the Russians say. That is roughly the same thing as losing all the family dwelling units in California, Arkansas, Arizona, Connecticut, Florida, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, and Virginia. Imagine another equivalent, that the entire population of New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, Baltimore, Cleveland, St. Louis, Boston, Pittsburgh, Washington, San Francisco, Milwaukee, Buffalo, and New Orleans had been rendered homeless by the war. How many of us would then be worrying about whether the Germans were being told how to vote, or whether the Austrians, 700,000 volunteered for Der Führer, were losing some of their factories, or whether the Hungarians, who boasted of killing 1 million Russians, had to suffer the pangs of inflation. Shall we speak seriously of reparations as compensation for Russia's experience? Who can revive her dead? All that is background to Soviet policies in Europe today. If we entirely ignore it, no bridge to the Russian mind can be found, nor to Yugoslavia, who lost 1,600,000 men out of a population of 17 million, nor to Poland, 5 million of whose inhabitants were killed by the Germans. Now, the same people who exulted in the light-hearted invasion of Russia and raised no protest against the looting of tens of thousands of villages, the rape of Russian women, the extermination of 6 million Jews and political prisoners of all races, the enslavement of millions of captured laborers, have seen a little retaliation. The Russians are taking back some of the tractors and livestock which the Germans stole or destroyed. Even if the penalties were 10 times as heavy, they would not today give back to Ivan his house, his boots, a winter coat for his daughter, or, incidentally, his dead sons. But we thought Russian demands are extortionate. With abbreviated means of production, some Germans might starve, innocent people might suffer. We pitied the Romanians and Hungarians." Unquote. As I said before, capitalist researchers have actually never provided definitive numbers of Hungarian prisoners of war in the USSR. The highest estimates are approximately 500,000, which includes the 200,000 Hungarian, German, Volksbund and Waffen-SS members, as well as the approximately 250,000 Hungarian soldiers who invaded the USSR. Many of the soldiers might not actually have become prisoners at all, as many of them died in the war. On top of that, Horthyist fascists and Arrow-Cross Nazis were obviously arrested by the Red Army in Hungary, but also in Austria and Germany because they had fled there. They were taken prisoner. These numbers don't really leave much room for so-called innocent people. The only alternative is the claim that the Hungarian soldiers, and perhaps Horthyists in general, were quote-unquote innocent people. Obviously, this claim doesn't really hold up to scrutiny. The soldiers were invaders, and the Horthyists were fascists. The destruction of the Hungarian invasion force. Quote, "The foreign policy of the Horthy government was wholly oriented on the achievement of imperialist, expansionist aims. Either in collaboration or with the support of other aggressive Western countries, the Horthy regime intended to seize the territories of a number of neighboring countries in the interest of Hungary's capitalists and the landlord oligarchy. Having come to power, Horthy immediately launched a broad program of Hungary's militarization, with a special emphasis on ideologically indoctrinating the population in the spirit of quote-unquote national unity, with the help of chauvinistic slogans about the so-called chosen mission of the Hungarian race, its so-called cultural superiority, and about a so-called Great Hungary dominating the Carpathian region. School children were taught to hate the neighboring nations, the Slavs in the first place. Revanchism was elevated to the status of official policy. Striving to enlarge Hungary's territory by annexing the lands of her neighbors, the Hungarian rulers sided with the Nazis long before Germany's attack on the USSR. For many years, they distorted Hungary's history in order to show that Hungary and Germany had a common destiny. They became most anxious to get on the good side of Nazi Germany after her invasion of Czechoslovakia in the hope of laying their hands on a part of Czechoslovakia. Meeting the imperialist ambitions of the Hungarian ruling circles, and at the same time furthering its own far-reaching plans of enslaving all the Danube countries, the Nazi leaders in the autumn of 1938 incorporated the southern part of Transcarpathian Ukraine and Slovakia into Hungary, and in March 1939 the entire Carpathian Ukraine became a part of Hungary. This enabled Hitler firmly to harness Hungary to his war chariot. Seeing that, as a result of the Munich deal, the Western powers gave Hitler full freedom of action in Southeast Europe, the Horthy clique decided to place its main stake on German Nazism. In February 1939, Hungary joined Hitler's anti-Comintern Pact, and at the end of August 1940, in keeping with the decision of the Second Vienna Arbitration, Hungarian troops occupied northern Transylvania, which was a part of Romania. In November 1940, Hungary joined the Tripartite Pact, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Militarist Japan, and thus became Nazi Germany's loyal satellite and a weapon of her expansionist policy. At first, Nazi Germany used Hungary as a springboard for invading Yugoslavia, and then on April 10, 1941, in violation of the so-called Treaty of Eternal Friendship of December 1940, Hungary attacked Yugoslavia and occupied a part of Vojvodina, thus becoming Hitler's active military ally." Unquote. But according to the anti-communists and Hungarian nationalists, Hungarian fascists and Hungarian soldiers shouldn't have to take any responsibility for any of that. They were merely innocent victims. We know the Hungarian fascist invaders participated in the Holocaust and committed terrible war crimes in the USSR and also in other countries. Already before World War II, the British had stated that, quote, "The pro-German attitude of the Hungarian Horthyist army command and officers presented potential danger." A British observer and friend of Prime Minister Teleki reported to the Foreign Office already in October 1938 that 80 to 90% of the army were Nazis. Unquote. This army, whose officers, according to the British, were 80 to 90% Nazis, was destroyed utterly in the war. This is where most of the prisoners of war came from. As Hungarian historian Halas writes, quote, "In January 1943, the Hungarian Second Army was destroyed completely near Voronezh, 40,000 Hungarian soldiers being killed and 70,000 being imprisoned the same day." Unquote. And as Hoensch writes, quote, "The Second Hungarian Army, which had around 200,000 combat troops, 50,000 occupation troops, and a labor service corps of 40,000 men, was to reinforce certain sectors on the Eastern Front from the spring of 1942 onwards." Unquote. Quote, "From the summer 1942 onwards, the Second Hungarian Army supported the northern wing of the German advance towards Stalingrad. Its almost complete annihilation at Voronezh on 12 January 1943 was of decisive importance for the future course of Hungarian politics. Prior to defeat, 7,000 men had already frozen to death. Heavy losses suffered in smaller engagements with the enemy had sapped the soldiers' morale, and because the German High Command prevented a timely retreat, 40,000 men were killed and 70,000 taken prisoner during the Soviet counter-offensive." Unquote. Historian Lendvai writes, quote, "The destruction of the poorly equipped 207-strong Second Hungarian Army at Voronezh in January 1943 was the political and psychological turning point in Hungary's participation in the Second World War. Over 40,000 soldiers died, 35,000 were wounded, many disappeared, and 60,000 were taken prisoner by the Soviets." Unquote. Helmreich states that practically all POWs were released in the period of few years, but he excludes the Hungarian Volksbund members, since they were arrested in Germany, and the Transylvanian SS members. Quote, "The total number of POWs, both members of the Hungarian army and civilians taken prisoner by the Soviet Union, was probably about 180,000. As of January 1st, 1946, there were approximately 175,000 still detained by the Soviet Union. The number of POWs returned during the 1946 to 49 period is about 165,000, unquote. Meaning that almost all soldiers and officials had to serve only a 3-year sentence or less, while about 5% were kept for a longer period. And keep in mind that these historians are by no means sympathetic to communism. Hoensch reveals his far-right bias by actually excluding Jews from the Hungarian war casualties, which is pretty crazy. He writes, quote, "Around 400,000 Hungarians had been killed in the Second World War," unquote. while in the Hungarian Holocaust 600,000 Jews had been killed, but he completely ignores them. Historian Roman states that in some Hungarian towns, the Soviet and Hungarian political police arrested some people, and perhaps they were arrested without sufficient cause. However, this wasn't Soviet policy. He writes, quote, "In a number of towns, the Soviet command used a local branch of the political police to round up young men for interrogation. Some of these were transferred to Soviet custody for further investigation, then disappeared. The actions were so haphazard and varied so widely from one locality to another that they could not possibly have been official policy." Unquote. Quote, "The High Command was able to curb that behavior only spasmodically and tried to counteract it in other ways." Unquote. Occurrences such as these were used by reactionary Hungarian nationalists and fascists and modern anti-communist propagandists, such as the Holocaust denier David Irving, and exaggerated out of all proportion into the completely absurd claim that the USSR supposedly deported hundreds of thousands of completely innocent Hungarians. There certainly were Horthyists and fascists who were arrested in Hungary by the Red Army. We saw earlier that the British estimated 90% of Hungarian officers to be Nazis. However, based on the available evidence, the number of those arrested seemed to be small. Roman writes that there are, quote, "reports that some 1,800 soldiers, mainly officers, engineers and doctors, have been taken out of the country." Unquote. Behavior of the Hungarian army inside the USSR. Now, let us discuss the behavior of the so-called innocent victims, the Hungarian fascist invaders. Did the Soviets have a justified reason for arresting them? As Christian Ungvari writes in an article in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies in 2007, quote, "The behavior of the Hungarian occupation forces was in many ways similar to that of the German occupation forces, and indeed, some aspects of their behavior were even more extreme. The Hungarian occupation forces systematically committed war crimes by laying waste to areas and executing the inhabitants of villages." Unquote. This is also what we saw Goebbels say earlier. Unfortunately, quote, "almost all documents from the occupation era were destroyed in Hungary. Records are also incomplete for the period between November 1941 and July 1942. Only fragments of the field command reports have survived. In most cases, the Hungarians murdered all, or at least many, residents of any village considered suspect. During the summer of 1942, the Hungarian Eastern Occupation Force started establishing large dead zones. On August 28th, the force commander, Lieutenant General Bakay, ordered the destruction of all habitable villages in the Desna-Sobotka-Snob Triangle. The division had to restrict itself to conducting punishment operations in the partisan area, taking care not to penetrate too far into the areas controlled by the partisans. Such an operation was carried out on March 20th by Battalion 3/44. The battalion itself suffered no losses, but 40 partisans were killed. 2 days later, however, Battalion 3/51 reported that it has burnt down the village of Shelia-Puccino and, quote-unquote, eliminated a large number of partisan collaborators without making contact with the enemy. In April, the Baumann Group and the 102nd Infantry Brigade reported that 1,380 partisans and collaborators had been eliminated at a cost of 51 deaths, 99 wounded, and 67 missing. 25 villages were incinerated during that month. Only occasionally, in addition to burning villages and executing villagers, the occupiers were able to capture some genuine partisans. Once the thaw started on April 10th, major operations were sometimes impossible to carry out. The Hungarians therefore contented themselves with burning down the nearest villages. The occupation forces suffered severe losses when fighting genuine partisans. On the other hand, 85% of the reported partisans were unarmed, probably because, unlike the partisans, villagers were unable to escape when surrounded. When encountering real partisans, for example at Igritskoje, the attackers suffered almost as many losses as the partisans. The Törli work group, part of the 6th Infantry Division, reported having exterminated 228 partisans on one day, while suffering only 2 casualties, 1 dead and 1 wounded itself. The division's primary activities consisted of laying waste to villages and shooting their residents. The Germans quickly realized that partisans could not be combated using the Hungarian methods. saying, quote, "In propaganda terms, their undisciplined and completely arbitrary behavior towards the local population can only harm German interests. Looting, rape, and other breaches are the order of the day." In addition to the ill feeling caused among the local population, it is apparent that the Hungarian troops are not in a position to defeat the enemy. Unquote. The following order of Major General Varganyi is characteristic. Quote, "Some of the partisans live in the surrounding villages, and were either staying in those villages or had returned there, and appeared to be working peaceably. For that reason, the villages of Yazany, Cherepovo, Ivanovsky, Sechulin, and adjacent villages to be specified by the commander of the 34th Infantry Regiment must be burnt down, and the entire male population, aged between 15 and 60, eliminated. Novaya Sloboda is to be torched. On June 26th, the armored company, together with a light anti-aircraft battery and sufficient infantry, is ordered to carry out this task." Unquote. Novaya Sloboda was attacked on June 6th. During the attack, 407 villagers were either executed by Hungarian infantry soldiers and the German tank company, or burned alive in their houses. Unquote. According to a Nazi Sonderkommando report, quote, "Residents were forced to take refuge in the woods when Hungarian troops appeared, since they even shot women and children found in the villages." Unquote. Ungvari also presents photographs that show that, quote, "The Hungarians apparently kept guard while the GFP, the German military secret police, were responsible for the so-called professional conduct of the operation, that is, of exterminations of Jews." In post-war Hungary, there were trials of fascist war criminals. Sometimes these photographs were used as evidence. For instance, in one trial it was proved that Hungarian fascist troops, together with German forces and Ukrainian fascist collaborators, carried out executions of Jewish civilians in a ghetto. Quote, "Photos 5, 6, and 7 were also taken in Gaishin a few weeks later, when the Jews were driven out, women, children, and men. Photos 10 and 11 show the naked victims walking to the place of execution. They were driven in groups, between 8 and 10, still alive, into the trenches, laid face down and shot. Photo 12 shows the mass grave with dead and mortally wounded victims. Some of the latter were still alive hours later." The investigation found that Hungarian troops had sealed off the ghetto in Gaishin. The executions themselves were carried out by Hungarian volunteers, the German police, and the auxiliary police. It is typical of the attitude displayed by some of the commanders that before deploying their soldiers to the Eastern Front, they held so-called partisan exercises in the ghettos of Hungarian cities. These so-called exercises degenerated into looting, while Jews were beaten up indiscriminately. The German authorities registered the interest displayed by Hungarian officers in the mass murder of Jews. The German Foreign Office's liaison officer in the general government drafted a complaint which, among other issues, dealt with the so-called murder tourism of Germany's allies. One constantly encounters Hungarian officers expressing keen interest in the Jewish question and its solution in the region of Galicia. Unquote. The Nazi report described the Hungarian conduct in the USSR as follows, quote, "Daily looting, often at gunpoint, abuse and rape." Unquote. Historian Roman writes that, quote, "Hungary's wartime behavior had been bad enough, but its distant past was not much more credible. Its shameful treatment of the peasantry by the gentry and the aristocracy, the blatant rank consciousness of the middle and upper classes, and the sometimes covert, at other times open, anti-Semitism were all blots on Hungary's post-war claim to being a civilized nation. Hungarians quite blatantly adopted all the slogans and attitudes of a master race. Horthy had enthusiastically endorsed Hitler's crusade against Soviet Russia." Unquote. Behavior of the Soviet troops in Hungary. Soviet behavior was the polar opposite of the Hungarians. Instead of depicting their counterparts as subhuman savages, as the Hungarian fascists had done to them, they described the Hungarians as a people of noble, progressive struggles, oppressed by fascism. Roman writes, quote, "At the meetings for Red Army men, the speakers explained that the nation which it was now their duty to conquer had a glorious past, distinguished by many noble struggles for progressive causes. These attempts were reinforced by the issuance of a multi-page pamphlet reminding the Soviet forces that Hungarians had for 400 years struggled against German oppression. It detailed phases of that struggle and furnished the impressive statistic that in the year 1917, some 200,000 Hungarian prisoners of war had joined the communist cause in Russia. The pamphlet drew a distinction between the laboring people and their fascist rulers. A closing proclamation admonished the soldiers to conduct themselves in a manner that would honor their own traditions and those of the Hungarian people. Unquote. Quote, the stories of the misconduct and even atrocities committed by the Soviet army in Hungary are manifestly exaggerated, and when levied against the army itself, or its command, or its policy, are undoubtedly false. As an example of one such story, the reactionary Hungarian politician Ferenc Nagy seriously charges that Russian women attached to units of the Red Army, comparable to our Walks, quote-unquote, raped and forced to unnatural excesses many thousands of Hungarian men, unquote. Forcing Hungarian men into excesses probably just means that Hungarian men had relations with Russian women, but since Ferenc Nagy considered the Russians subhuman savages, he had to say that the Russian women must have forced the Hungarian men into it. Quote, it would be wrong to identify the working population of Hungary, enslaved by German and Hungarian fascism, with the criminal Hungarian government, said the statement of the Military Council of the Second Ukrainian Front. Unquote. The Soviet troops actually helped restore life to Hungary. Quote, Budapest was returning to life. With lightning speed, the news spread among its war-weary, starving inhabitants that the Soviet Union, whose population was short of food itself, provided them with 33,000 tons of grain, 4,400 tons of meat, 3,300 tons of sugar, and 180 tons of coffee. At the request of the Budapest communists and local self-government bodies, the engineers of the Second Ukrainian Front repaired the bridge across the Danube linking the capital's eastern and western parts, removed mines from residential houses and industrial enterprises, and provided technical assistance in rehabilitating and putting a number of factories and mills back into operation. Unquote. Release of the prisoners of war. Despite all that was said previously, the majority of Hungarian soldiers were conscripts. They had been forced into the war and had been brainwashed by nationalism. The Soviet Union agreed to begin releasing ordinary soldiers quickly after their investigation. A leading role in returning Hungarian prisoners was performed by the Communist Party. Quote, Rákosi, the leader of the Communist Party, proclaimed the Communists would urge on the release of Hungarian prisoners of war and the return of the national assets taken abroad to the West at the end of the war. Unquote. Anti-communist historian Pünkösti writes that communists came out with slogans such as, quote, the immediate repatriation of Hungarian prisoners of war, unquote. Historian Béla Zilitsky writes, quote, the first Hungarian ambassador to the USSR in the post-war period, the historian Gyula Sekfő, pointed out after the 1946 negotiations that these talks paved the way for the development of normal Soviet-Hungarian relations, and it can be expected that the Soviet side will be friendly and cautious in its approach to the problems of occupation, reparations, prisoners of war, and in the matter of the forthcoming peace treaty. From October 1945 to October 1946, of 550,000 to 570,000 Hungarian soldiers taken prisoner on the territories of the USSR, Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Germany, 300,000 were allowed to return to their native land, and by the end of 1947, 120,000 more were released. Unquote. Zilitsky's numbers of prisoners are so high that it obviously must include the Germans. Possibly he also includes people who were not prisoners, but had simply died in battle. In any case, he says that already by 1947, 420,000 POWs returned. Helmreich had stated that, excluding the Germans, there were 180,000 prisoners, of whom 165,000 returned by 1949. Roman writes that Stalin, quote, promised to begin to return prisoners of war even before signing of the peace, planned for 1947, as transportation facilities and administrative procedures permit, unquote. He writes further that, quote, in August, Klement Voroshilov announced that all Hungarian prisoners of war would, by the order of the President of the Supreme Soviet, be released. There is no reason to believe that the promise was made in less than good faith. In the next 2 months, a few trainloads of prisoners came home. Finally, at the end of January 1948, talks on the repatriation of prisoners of war were successfully completed. Unquote. However, some prisoners, SS members, war criminals, etc. had to be weeded out, while the ordinary POWs could be released. Roman writes, quote, "Most likely, the large-scale return of prisoners entailed logistical difficulties the Soviets had not anticipated. When a year and a half later, a formal agreement for the repatriation of POWs was about to be concluded, Communist Erno Gerö wrote to smallholder Jan Yossi that apart from the transportation problem, there was a political one too. There were, among the prisoners, many who were, quote-unquote, undesirable to Hungarian democracy, even dangerous elements who had to be separated from the others," unquote. Did the Soviets impose socialism on Hungary? Even according to capitalist historians, the answer is no. Roman writes, quote, "The process of revolution and socialist construction was gradual and halting, and brought on more by the psychological pressures of the Cold War than by dictation from Moscow. A change of political direction in Hungary began at the turn of the year and gained strength during 1947, but it was due to internal developments, with the Soviets playing only an ancillary role. It is convenient to date gradual Sovietization from this time, but not as a phase of a pre-existing program. There is no shred of evidence that the Soviets had such a program," unquote. And as Romanian anti-communist historian Tismanenu writes, quote, "There was no unique path to Stalinization in Eastern Europe. There was no master plan that was designed by some evening in the Kremlin by Stalin and his inner circle," unquote. And Roman writes further, quote, "The Soviets exerted very little influence on Hungarian foreign policy or indeed on internal affairs. Not until the debate over the Marshall Plan was some pressure exerted, and even then it took the modest form of the Soviet envoy explaining his government's negative position. There was nothing to prevent the cabinet from voting in favor of sending a delegation to Paris. The Soviets might have expressed displeasure, as they had the year before when Ferenc Nagy led a government delegation to the western capitals, but almost certainly would not have gone beyond that," unquote. Hungary's war reparations to the USSR. Northeast Hungary had always been totally hostile to the USSR. Even when Horthy decided he wanted to leave the war, he did not want to make any kind of peace with the USSR. As Roman writes, quote, "During World War II, as we shall see, the Hungarian government and the ruling circles spared no effort to effect an armistice with the Western powers to the total exclusion of the Soviet Union," unquote. However, the Soviet Union treated the new democratic Hungary more than fairly. Quote, "Stalin asked for little more than that Hungary pay for part of the damage its armies had inflicted on Russia," unquote. In fact, anti-communist historian Roman goes as far as to say, quote, "Stalin's leniency towards Hungary in these critical years remains a puzzle," unquote. I'm sure it remains a puzzle to those who delusionally wanted to see the Soviet Union as some kind of a monster. The Soviet Union also began giving aid to Hungarians and returned captured Hungarian industries. Quote, "In June 1945, the USSR made a big food donation to the capital Budapest. In July, it returned the coal mines it had seized to Hungarian control. In October, the railroads were restored to Hungarian government ownership. By conservative estimates, the total value of goods lost or stolen amounted to some $13 billion in 1938 prices. Most of the displaced assets were in the American occupation zone in Germany and in Austria," unquote. And, unlike the USSR, the United States refused to return the Hungarian property. 6 years later, in 1951, the US was still engaged in a diplomatic battle with Hungary and was refusing to return the property. Quote, 1951, June 15th. A further note by the United States government to the Hungarian government refuses the restoration of the Hungarian property in the American zone of Western Germany in flagrant violation of the pertinent provisions of the peace treaty and of other obligations undertaken by the United States government," unquote. Since 1949, the US and their West German puppets had begun selling the Hungarian property. Quote, 1949, October. On the order of the United States occupation authorities, the Bavarian Minister of Economic Affairs has a part of the Hungarian goods taken to the West by fascists auctioned at Regensburg," unquote. The Soviets helped kickstart Hungarian industries by setting up temporary joint-owned Hungarian-Soviet companies in certain fields. As usual, in their propaganda, the Americans claimed that this was an exploitative act to enslave Hungary, but in their own secret, internal communications, they admitted that this was beneficial to Hungary. The American diplomat Schoenfeld, quote, assured the State Department that the trade agreement with Moscow was generally profitable to Hungary. He later added, however, creation of jointly owned company for exploitation of oil resources will probably affect adversely American oil interests here, unquote. The Americans were claiming in their propaganda that the reparations to the Soviet Union were unfair and oppressive, but again, secretly, they admitted that the reparations were completely reasonable. Quote, U.S. Ambassador Harriman, though he officially complained that the reparations burden was too heavy, had private thoughts to the contrary on the matter. He wrote to Secretary of State Edward Stettines on December 31, 1944, quote, I must confess that I have some sympathy for the Soviet view that $50 million a year of goods as reparations payments from Hungary over a 6-year period is not, in fact, excessive, unquote. However, the USSR agreed to give Hungary even more time. In 1946, quote, Stalin agreed that reparations deliveries be spread out from 6 years stipulated in the armistice agreement to 8 years, and that delivery of finished textile goods under the commercial agreement be postponed by a year, unquote. In 1946, quote, the USSR had already decided to reduce Hungary's reparations bill to 200 million, unquote, and supported the Hungarians at the 1946 Paris Peace Conference. Hungary was in such a poor position to negotiate that the Soviet help was invaluable. Quote, that the Hungarian delegation did good work was evidenced by the fact that the Soviet delegation supported it on many questions. Considering its past, Hungary could have done worse. Unquote. Quote, on December 20th, 1947, Moscow had advised the Hungarian government of a great reduction of Soviet military personnel on Hungarian soil. The same day, Pushkin communicated the decision that the price of goods Hungary delivered in reparations would be raised, and that such goods no longer had to be shipped to the Soviet Union, but could be handed over in designated Danube ports. According to press reports, these concessions lowered reparation obligations by over $17 million. Unquote. According to Hoensch, quote, the Soviet government halved Hungary's remaining reparations debt up to 1st July 1948. Unquote. Even the particularly reactionary historian Pünkösti writes that, quote, at the suggestion of the Hungarian Communist Party, the Hungarian government asked the Soviet government to reduce the amount of reparations. That the amount was reduced by 65 million, we can still be glad today. Unquote. Historian Borhi writes that, quote, in 1949 the Soviet Union cancelled the accrued penalty for late shipments, agreed to write off the value of a formerly Hungarian-owned coal mine in Transylvania, raised the deadline for payment from 6 to 8 years, and cancelled 50% of the remaining obligations. Unquote. And Zelitsky writes that, quote, after the communist regime was established in Hungary in 1948, the Soviet Union, having received the first third of the reparation payment, $134.3 million, cancelled the remaining debt of $65.7 million by a decision of the USSR Council of Ministers on August 18, 1953. Unquote. As usual, the right-wing smallholder party had claimed, quote, that without a loan from the Western imperialists, the economy could not be stabilized and reparations could not be paid. Unquote. They were proven wrong, as always. In 1953, Rákosi was happy to announce that, quote, I am now in the position to inform the honored parliament of the fact that on the 20th of next month the reparation payments to the Soviet Union will have been completed. Hostile rumors at the time had it that the reparations obligations imposed unbearable burdens on us. Thanks to the generosity of the Soviet Union in considerably reducing the sum of the reparation payments and extending the term of payment from 6 years to 8 years, we have been able to live up to this obligation with honor. At the same time, with the friendly and selfless aid of the Soviet Union, we have been able to build our socialist future successfully and rapidly. Unquote.